Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from, whichever part of the world, welcome. We're just about to have an exciting session in this HLPF event that's been organized by the CPF, the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, entitled The Role of Forests in Time of Crisis, Sustainable Production and Consumption Patterns to Turn the Tide. On deforestation. We have such a fantastic panel of speakers. Good morning to Francesca all the way in New York. We're looking forward to having the keynote from you. My name is Musonda Mumba, and I'm the director for the UNDP Rome Center on Sustainable Development. Welcome. Just some quick house rules. You have the option to actually type out your question in the Q&A function. Box, as you can see it here on Zoom. Please give us your name. We would like to know where you are and where you're writing from, and whether it's a targeted question for specific panelists or for general question that you want any of the panel members to address. We're absolutely very excited to have you all. And just kindly note that this is going to be only in English, and as such will be recorded and will be shared on many platforms, including YouTube. So before we begin, I don't know about you, but I've been living in Nairobi, Kenya, where I happen to be so fortunate to have a forest in the city. And in the middle of this COVID pandemic crisis, I was fortunate enough to just take my children into the forest and just deal with the stress and duress of this space that we have found ourselves in the world, a pandemic. And yet in our everyday lives, we use a table, we use a bed, we use a chair. In fact, we're sitting on some chair made from wood or maybe another material from somewhere in the world. So in this conversation, we're going to really look at the urgency of all these different dynamics, reducing poverty, climate change, and how the intersection in the element of deforestation. How can we live sustainably? How do we change the way we live? How can we be secular, more renewable, and also not source products that we use in our everyday lives and that create deforestation in different landscapes? How can we change the way we navigate our consumption and production patterns? So I'm really, really excited to have such amazing panelists here. And also just really to say 31% of the world's landscapes are forests, such beautiful spaces that we all depend on for fresh air, for breathing, and all of that. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to Maria Francesca Spato-Lizano, who is the Assistant Secretary General for the Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs at UNDESA in New York, who's going to give us the keynote speech. Over to you, please.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to join you today at this event organized by the Collaborative Partnership on Forests. The theme of this event is timely and critical as we join forces to address the challenge we face due to the current health, socioeconomic, and environmental crisis, and explore the opportunities that arise from the crisis. The need to restore balance with nature has never been so urgent. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact all countries around the world, devastating the lives of people, upending economies, threatening societies, and increasing inequalities, negatively affecting the lives of women and girls disproportionately, and thus creating major setbacks to global efforts to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. While the global economy is now projected to expand by 5.4% in 2021, we are looking at the possibility of nearly 34 million people at risk of starvation. It is the poorest, the weakest, and the most vulnerable who are suffering the most. And many of these communities are forest-dependent communities, including indigenous peoples. We are also facing a nature crisis. According to the latest assessment, as much as 75% of the land surface has been significantly altered globally. Over 85% of wetlands has been lost, and 1 million animal and plant species are threatened threatened with extinction, along with severe environmental degradation. We have already reached the 1.2 degree of warming and are witnessing unprecedented climate extremes and volatility in every region and on every continent. As the world economy rebounds, we must make sure to build irreversible momentum and take concrete steps to safeguard our nature by engineering a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery. Dear colleagues, it is undeniable that sustainably managed forests play a fundamental role to maintain the vital balance between nature and human life. Yet forests continue to face growing threats of degradation, devastating fires, illegal logging, pests, and extreme weather events. The recovery from the pandemic must become also our chance to change course. With smart policies and the right investments, we must chart a path that can revive economies, build resilience, and turn the tide on deforestation. The time has come to integrate forests and other ecosystems into all economic decisions to ensure a sustainable future for all. In April 2021, the UN Forum on Forest launched its first flagship publication, the Global Forest Goals Report 2021, at its 16th session. This report provides an initial overview of progress towards achieving the 6 Global Forest Goals and their 26 associated targets, as contained within the UN Strategic Plan for Forests. According to this report, while the world has been making progress in key areas, such as increasing the forest area, these advances are being threatened by the overall worsening state of the natural environment, including climate change, loss of biodiversity, and land degradation and droughts. The 16th session of the UN Forum on Forest also held a high-level roundtable to discuss major forest-related developments and technical discussions on its thematic priorities. The forum's discussions highlighted a number of measures and recommendations to advance sustainable consumption and production patterns and turn the tide on deforestation. What are these recommendations about? Let's briefly see them. First, it is critically important to build momentum to halt illegal and unsustainable forest practices, to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 and reduce the risk of future zoonotic diseases, minimize the impacts on global trade and supply chains, leverage action to build more sustainable production and resilient supply chains, and provide more diverse livelihoods. In doing so, appropriate policy and fiscal frameworks are needed to facilitate and promote private sector involvement in sustainable supply chains. The private sector should be responsive and agile and more proactive in advancing sustainable forest management practices. Second, we must also redouble efforts and use the potential of forests to provide social protection and safety nets, especially to the vulnerable groups, and make societies more resilient and better prepared for health and humanitarian emergencies. The pandemic presents a unique opportunity to accelerate actions to tackle the drivers of deforestation and forest degradation. Third, science and technology, adequate financing resources, and increased capacity building, data collection, and analysis are all critically important in addressing the negative impact of COVID-19 and reducing the risk of future pandemics. A better science policy society interface, increased investment, and more effective governance are essential for a better recovery from the current crisis. Fourth, strengthening intersectoral consultation, cross-sectoral collaboration, and stakeholder engagement are important steps to ensure sustainable and integrated land use planning. The pandemic has also highlighted the need for enhanced use of online learning platforms and the expanded use of information and communication technologies. All this means that forests have the potential to offset many of the social, economic, and environmental impacts of the pandemic and other global challenges. It is therefore critical to strengthen sustainable forest management and actions to halt illegal and unsustainable forest practices within the ongoing pandemic recovery strategies. Hence, I wish to encourage the collaborative partnership on forests and its member organizations to continue to join forces and pursue its role in supporting the progress towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Forest Goals. As a member and the Secretariat of the partnership, we in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations stand ready to support and jointly advance the work of the partnership. Before I conclude, let me recall that next year in 2022, the Forum will decide on the parameters and scope of the midterm review of the International Arrangement on Forest in preparation for the review in 2024. In light of the increased role of forests in advancing the SDGs, Decade of Action, and in addressing multiple global challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and zoonotic diseases, it is vital to strengthen the mandate of the Forum in playing a stronger role in promoting a synergetic and integrated nature-based agenda to deal with these challenges. In this regard, the collaborative partnership on forests should also aim to solidify its support to the work of the Forum as the only universal intergovernmental body on forest within the UN system, as well as on the implementation, of course, of the UN Strategic Plan for Forest through development of focused, simple, and result-based work plans. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ms. Spatolizzato, for that brilliant and excellent speech. In fact, you really touched a nerve there, and the reference to the Global Forest report that was launched in April of this year. I just want to add on a sort of a quick question as we navigate this pandemic, and we're hearing from scientists. And thank you for those 6 highlights from that high-level roundtable discussion. We are going to be navigating a world of more pandemics. What do you think governments should do more? Especially you referenced the Decade of Action. We've also entered the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. What can we do more?
Well, there is a lot which can be done, and some has been done. Let me say, according to the findings of the Global Forest Goals Report 2021 I was mentioning, countries are already taking a wide range of actions on forest to implement the UN Strategic Plan on Forest and the 2030 Agenda. For instance, they accelerated the implementation of their national forest laws and strategies to sustainably manage forests. They established stakeholder consultations to ensure informed policy making on forests, and they sought to mainstream forest and other ecosystem across the other sectors. And as a result of these efforts, several regions are on track to increase their forest area by 3% by 2030. Most regions, I would say, are on track to significantly increase or maintain the forest area under long-term management plans. And the area of certified forest expanded, as did the supply of wood from certified and other sustainably managed forests. However, concurrently, we are experiencing escalating impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss, as I said, and the world continues to reel from the devastating impact of the pandemic. So there are concerns that the global recession could eventually lead to reduced flows of international public financing for forests. And it is undeniable that forests are central to global well-being, but this vital role must be further promoted with greater commitment and multilateral action to build further momentum for action at all levels and join forces. That would be my main recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and a very valid and important point on the necessity and importance of multilateral action. Thank you very much for your amazing keynote speech. Thank you very much, and you have a lovely morning. I would like now to introduce the next panel of speakers who are going to be really talking about now the crux of the matter on how we could potentially turn the tide on deforestation as we navigate this crisis. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce them in this order. We're going to have Ms. Mette Wilkie, who is the chair of the Collaborative Partnership on Forest, who I'm obviously the vice chair for, and also the director of FAO Forestry Division. And then we're going to also have Mr. Dirk Schatzschneider, who is the Deputy Director General at the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. And in London, we're going to have Ms. Sham Sadhguru, who is the Director of Operations at the International Tropical Timber Organization. Lastly, but not the least, all the way in beautiful Kumasi in Ghana, we're going to have Ms. Nana Ama Asante, who is the Project Officer for Cocoa Palm Farmers Association in Ghana. Mette, I'd like to turn to you. You're the chair of CPF, and you also happen to be the director of forests. And I mean, you see it all within FAO and also within this partnership. We are navigating a crisis, and I'd like you to just really give us a context and tell the world how we dealing with this changes and also the issues of sustainable consumption and production. Over.
Thank you, Musonda, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today and talk to you a little bit about what it is that's needed for us to halt and deforestation, to turn the tide on deforestation. And my key message is this: we really need to urgently move to more sustainable production and consumption patterns for many reasons, including to turn the tide on deforestation. But let me walk you through some of the evidence and the data that lies behind this key message from my side. Two publications were published by FAO last year. The State of the World's Forest looked at forest biodiversity and people and progress towards meeting all of the forest-related biodiversity targets across very many different agencies, institutions, reporting mechanisms, etc. We also published the results of the Global Forest Resources Assessment 2020, which provides a picture of how we are managing the world's forest and how we have been doing so for the last 30 years. And lastly, we in the Collaborative Partnership on Forest have put together a number of key messages related to the challenges and opportunities in turning the tide on deforestation. So just to set the stage for this, we have heard already that forests of the world cover some 31% of the land area, about 4 billion hectares. They are found from the boreal forest in the north to the temperate forest, tropical and subtropical forests, as you can see. Very many different types of forests in very many different areas, climatic zones. So it's very difficult to generate some key messages across them all, but let me just come up with a couple of very general messages to start with. Every one of us depend upon forests and the benefits that they provide. Some of us more than others. Forests provide the air that we breathe, most of the water that we drink. They provide habitat for a vast majority of the terrestrial biodiversity, and we cannot meet the climate goals without them. Forests also provide us numerous products for everyday life. We've heard that from Musonda already, from the chairs that we're sitting on, the desk we're sitting at, the buildings, to even the products that we're using during the pandemic. So the cardboard boxes for transporting things, even the gloves and the masks that we're wearing are partly made from forests. They also provide livelihoods and human well-being. More than 86 million green jobs. We have many millions of people relying on forest for production of and collection and production of fuel, wood and charcoal. As Musanda was saying, we all rely on forest also for our well-being in terms of the recreation, and of course, also from all the books that we enjoy reading in our spare time. But they are also linked to food security, and they help reduce hunger and contribute to healthy diets. More than 1 billion people depend on wild foods, and 35% of the global food production benefits from animal pollination. Many of those pollinators are found in forests. Not to mention the fact that 2.4 billion people, that's about 1/3 of the population globally, depend on fuel wood for cooking their daily meals. So we have numerous benefits from forest, but my second message, unfortunately, is this, that despite all of these benefits and despite some progress, deforestation and forest degradation continue at alarming rates. We know from the Global Forest Resources Assessment 2020 that progress has been made from minus 16 million hectares per year in the 1990s to 10 million hectares per year in the last 5 years. That's the rate of deforestation, but it's still alarmingly high. To put that into context, it's twice the size of a country like Costa Rica. And that's every year. There's also been changes on where deforestation is happening. It was primarily in South America, but as you can see, they have reduced the rates significantly in the last 10 years. Whereas in Africa, deforestation rates are continuing to increase. My third message is that agricultural expansion continues to be the main driver of deforestation and forest fragmentation. Large-scale agriculture is responsible for about 40% of tropical deforestation and small-scale agriculture for an additional 33%. But these drivers, of course, vary between continents, between countries, and even within countries. But generally speaking, we can see that in Latin America, the one in the middle on the left, the big orange one is from commercial agriculture. That's the main driver. In Africa, further on the left, it's the blue color, which is local subsistence agriculture. That's the main driver. Whereas in Asia, it's a bit more mixed, and urban expansion, the light blue, also plays a role. My fourth message is one of hope, because feeding humanity and conserving forest ecosystems are complementary and interdependent goals. We heard already that a number of progress have been made in a number of areas. Actions to combat deforestation and illegal logging have gathered pace. Countries have pledged to restore more than 1 billion hectares of degraded land, much of that forest land. And pledges have been made by the private sector to deforestation-free commodity chains. We can see here that some commodities are more important in terms of deforestation than others. We can also see here that there has been progress in number of companies that have pledged deforestation-free commodity chains. Those are the darker colors, but we can also see that much more needs to be done with the lighter colors here in all of the sectors that we are looking at. In 2014, a coalition of governments and companies, civil society organizations endorsed the New York Declaration on Forest. And now 200 endorsers have agreed to work towards halving tropical deforestation rates by 2020 and ending deforestation in the tropics by 2030. The first goal was clearly not reached. We could still reach the second if we make concerted effort. But in 2019, they did an assessment and found that globally we have not made progress towards ending the loss of natural forest, and some concerns about the increasing rate of loss of primary forest in some countries and areas. So my last and very important message is that we do need to take bold action to reverse the loss of forest and their biodiversity for the benefit of people and the planet. To do so, we need to protect, manage, and restore our forests. To protect our forests and the benefits they provide, we need to ensure responsible consumption and production of the food we eat. We need to transform our food systems. We need to halt expansion into forests and other natural habitats. But at the same time, we know that we also need to increase food production to feed the world. So in order to do that, we need to reduce food loss and waste. We need to implement sustainable intensification actions and sustainable production practices. We need to restore the productivity and the health of degraded land so that it can produce more. And we need to, each one of us, to embrace healthier diets and responsible consumption patterns. To manage our forests better, we need to balance conservation and sustainable use. We do need to mainstream biodiversity conservation into both agriculture and forestry, to use a landscape level approach and promote sustainable forest-based livelihoods. Clearly, we need to build on the knowledge and respect the rights of Indigenous people and local communities, ensure policy coherence, and by that I mean reform subsidies and incentive systems. And we need to make sure that we come up with and employ some more incentive systems for investment and in forests and forest-based livelihoods. But we also need to repair the damage done. We need to restore degraded ecosystems, to restore that health and productivity of agri-food systems. When we do that, we also conserve biodiversity, and that includes the wild crop-related species that we use for our food production systems, but also the pollinators and the natural pest control agents. By restoring degraded ecosystems, we also adapt to and mitigate climate change, and we create jobs, livelihoods, and food security. So there are ways in which we can build back better, but forests need to be an integral part at our efforts to do so. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for your attention and look forward to the rest of this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mette. Thank you very much for those fantastic remarks that you've just given us there. It's interesting, you showed that really interesting graph where you can see where the deforestation has sort of being managed, there's an improvement. And I noticed that obviously, you know, we see that there's a problem, a huge problem on the African continent. How do we tackle this?
That's a good question, Musonda. And if I knew that, we wouldn't be having this discussion here today, I don't think. There is no easy solution. As we've seen in Africa, the deforestation rate is going up. But that's because the drivers are so difficult to address. The underlying drivers of deforestation in Africa are poverty, food insecurity, population increase. There is no easy way to tackle this. We do know that it's primarily small-scale agriculture. We also know that more than 90% of all the wood that's cut on the African continent is used as wood fuel, either as firewood or charcoal to cook the daily meals. So we really need to tackle those underlying drivers. We do need to tackle poverty. We do need to come up with alternative livelihoods that are sustainable, in many cases that are based on forest, to address both the lack of livelihoods and the poverty, but also the food insecurity. There are a number of efforts ongoing that are really promising, and I just want to mention one, the Great Green Wall in the Sahel. It's one of the most inhospitable places to try and have sustainable management of the natural resources. But by using indigenous species, by combining trees with food plants and fodder plants, and using new techniques to have some deep plowing to make sure that the little rainwater that comes actually remains in the areas where it makes most benefits to the plants and the seeds that are put in the ground. We've seen that we can really make a big difference. And there are many other examples that we are hoping to make some bit more promotion of as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, because one of the things we really need to do in Africa is to restore the degraded land, make them more productive, to help both enhance food security, but also livelihoods.
No, thank you very much. And your reference to the Great Green Wall, certainly the world's largest restoration initiative, as it were. and reading this beautiful and mosaic landscape and just fascinating, and the complexity of issues and challenges. But you really hit the nail on the head. How do we bring all these elements together to make sure that we're also, providing livelihoods, because you say people and planet, as it were. No, thank you very much for those remarks, and obviously the insight into how best we navigate the complexity. And I would like to turn over to Mr. Dirk Schneider, who is the Deputy Director General of the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany, who will give us some insights from the consumer country, outlining its responsibilities towards sustainability and environmental friendly behavior, as it were, around forest products. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Musonda. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I also greet my fellow panelists, all guests around the globe, and of course the keynote speaker, Mrs. Spatolisano. Thank you to the Collaborative Partnership on Forests for inviting the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development today to have a seat here on this outstanding panel. I would like to give some perspectives on linkages between deforestation and agricultural commodities. From my ministry's point of view, we cannot achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without protecting forests, because forests are habitat for millions of species. They provide livelihoods to millions of people, as Mette was indicating, and the forests are important allies to combat climate change. This was mentioned as well. And also agriculture depends on forests and their ecosystem services. And here's a linkage to the food systems. However, as we all know, deforestation continues with the expansion of agriculture, driving about 80% of deforestation in the tropics alone. Thereby, consumption patterns play a role. The European Union and other markets import agricultural commodities that replace forests in producing countries. And unfortunately, the European Union ranks second on the infamous list of the world's top destroyers of forests on the consumer side, directly after China and before India, the United States, and Japan. This means time is running to turn the tide on deforestation, as United Nations Secretary General formulated it some years ago. Therefore, we need aligned action on demand side. I'm glad that the G7 Trade and Environment Ministers' communiques recently emphasized the need to decouple agricultural production from deforestation, both through regulatory frameworks and trade policy approaches via the WTO. As a mandatory element of a smart mix, our ministry strongly welcomes the upcoming legislative initiatives in the European Union, in the United Kingdom, and in the United States to develop regulatory frameworks on halting deforestation. Germany notably welcomes the European Commission's announcement of the legislative proposal to avoid deforestation and forest degradation. We see the need for ambitious EU measures that cover all relevant commodities, such as palm oil, soy, beef, cocoa, and natural rubber. Measures need to be implemented both on consumption and production side. Partnerships between producer and consumer countries will be key to turn the tide on deforestation. Moreover, as we all know, the upcoming COP meetings on climate and biodiversity provide an opportunity to reaffirm forest conservation as a global goal and pave the way for such partnerships. The private sector as well has a key role to play in a smart mix. We strongly welcome the private sector's engagement for forest positive supply chains that is catalyzed through initiatives such as the Tropical Forest Alliance. However, the continuing high deforestation rates show regulatory frameworks are needed and the private sector needs to intensify its action. So what can we do? Now, to help guide private companies from commitment to action, BMZ will support OECD and FAO with the development of an OECD FAO practical business tool on deforestation, forest degradation, and due diligence in agricultural supply chains. And this is supposed to be a very hands-on tool for use by private companies. Moreover, we work with partners such as the Tropical Forest Alliance, TRACE, and the Global Platform on Sustainable Natural Rubber on tackling commodity-driven deforestation. Of course, as a ministry, we are also active on the producing and the bilateral side. We support, for example, Indonesia, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, and Cote d'Ivoire through bilateral joint projects with reducing deforestation. Thereby, it's crucial for us to ensure support for the livelihoods and rights of smallholders and local indigenous communities, because in the end, we all know there can be no forests without people and no people without forests. I thank you for your attention. I thank you, Mette, as chair of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, for thinking forests so holistically also in your presentation. And I have to say once again, thank you for inviting us and me in person. And I thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
No, thank you very much, Dirk. I think you really touched a point there, particularly on SDG 17, which is really about partnerships, really having those collaborations. And you mentioned some of the sort of bilateral supports to reducing deforestation, but also this consumer producer discussion, as it were. So I have a question for you. So for thinking beyond the demand side of measures, what is BMZ's perspective on production side of measures, as it were?
Thank you, Sandro. Great question. For us, it is absolutely key that consumer and producer countries work together and jointly implement measures to keep forests standing. I mean, this cannot be a prescription by one side to the other. Mm-hmm. It's all about cooperation. Besides that, we must think, as I mentioned, that for a smart mix for forests on a global level. So we have let's say, bilateral level, a global level, we have a multi-stakeholder level, so it's really a complex system. And we really feel that especially the European Union as a large player in deforestation must complement upcoming regulation with support for producing countries, for example, through the EU forest partnerships and forest relevant Team Europe initiatives, mm-hmm. as we call it. There are a lot of other examples, for example, the EU cocoa talks with Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and all this has to go hand in hand and interlinked.
Great. I'm also very curious. I mean, you did talk about the agriculture element as well in relation to turning the tide on deforestation. What are your perspectives as the key factors to effectively minimize this expansion of agriculture into forest areas?
Well, I think there are 3 or 4 key factors. First, I think everybody has to recognize that agriculture and thereby food security and supply mm-hmm. Depend on forests and the ecosystem services provided by forests. Second, we have to move beyond voluntary measures, talking about regulatory frameworks. I mentioned that in my presentation. Mm-hmm. Third, we have to include all relevant stakeholders. I repeat that. And fourth and last, we have to address poverty also through living incomes and provide incentives for communities at current deforestation hotspots not to deforest. So we have to consider their economic and social interests and provide alternatives for deforestation.
Great. No, thank you very much for that insight, going beyond the regulatory frameworks and also making sure that we identify these key hotspots in order to also support people and planet, very much in line with Meta's message as well. Thank you very much, Dirk. I'd like now to turn over to Sham Satkuru. Ms. Satkuru is the Director of Operations, International Tropical Timber Organization. And she will be talking to us a little bit about ITTO's activities on legal and sustainable tropical timber supply chains. I look forward to really hearing the legalities of all of this and why this actually really matters within this sort of global landscape, as it were. But before you take the floor, I just want to mention to everybody listening out there, please remember we do have the Q&A function. Type in a question there or a remark, give us your name, tell us where you are writing from. And so now I'd like to hand over to Ms. Satkuru, please. Over to you. Do we have Ms. Sham Satkuru? Or have we lost her?
I'm so sorry, Musanda.
There, where you're muted. Totally
I was
understandable
muted.
in this webinar world. Over to you.
I'm so sorry, but thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and a very good afternoon to fellow panelists and distinguished participants at this prestigious event, for which I'm very grateful to have been given the privilege to speak at. Now, Mette, as CPF chair, made some very pertinent points, and I thank her for already highlighting a number of key issues which are of critical importance to all the CPF partners and organizations that have these joint aims of trying to turn the tide on deforestation. Simultaneously, Dirk has also mentioned a number of key activities and points that are of concern and of interest to the ITTO, and the arrangement of the panel speakers has been spectacular, actually, because what I will talk about now is a little bit on how producers and consumers have been collaborating under the auspices of the International Tropical Timber Agreement of 2006. Just as a brief background, ITTO is an intergovernmental organization of 74 members with almost a 50-50 balance of consuming and producing member countries. It is, of course, governed by the ITTA, the International Tropical Timber Agreement 2006, under the auspices of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. We are hosted with the generous support from the government of Japan in the beautiful city of Yokohama. ITTO's mandate, as specified under the ITTA 2006, is to assist our member countries in the implementation of sustainable forest management and to diversify the trade in tropical timber products. Incidentally, Mette had mentioned a number of key statistics on forest areas relating to the SOFOR reports and the Forest Resource Assessment reports. Now, it may be of interest to note that tropical forests account for approximately 45% of the global forest area of 4 billion hectares. As an organization, ITTO has over 30 years of experience in the implementation of over 1,200 projects on the ground, bringing together local and indigenous communities, governments, and the private sector to aspire towards the sustainable management of tropical forests. We have helped to improve sustainable forest management practices, develop viable forest-based industries, and increase the transparency of the tropical timber trade while keeping forest ecosystems intact. The implementation of ground projects demonstrating sustainable and best practices have greatly contributed to evidencing the potential that tropical forests hold to ensure the sustained provision of goods and services needed to realize sustainable development, where the health and productivity of forests remain critical. The ITTO's active engagement with the CPF is also council mandated, and in this respect, the ITTO are co-leads in a number of collaborative partnership on forest joint initiatives, such as the Sustainable Wood for a Sustainable World, which encompasses the involvement of private sector and smallholders. We are also involved in forest landscape restoration, applying the ITTO guidelines for forest landscape restoration in the tropics, which attempts to deal with reforestation and afforestation practices in terms of turning to minimize forest degradation. And we're also involved in the Green Growth and Investments Joint Initiative for Tropical Forests. Now, on this slide is what you see now on the screen is ITTO's vision of how the Sustainable Wood for Sustainable World Joint Initiative and the Sustainable Development Goals can be connected and be achieved with, of course, the full collaboration and cooperation of all partners are involved. Now, as you see on this slide, there are various Sustainable Development Goals that can be achieved if we are concerted enough in addressing sustainable production and consumption patterns. Next slide, please. Now, the priority areas you can see on the next slide are ITTO's priority areas, where the Legal and Sustainable Supply Chains Initiative is aimed at facilitating transparency in supply chains, supporting and complementing the CPF Joint Initiative on sustainable wood for a sustainable world. And our mantra on this should be build back better sustainably. In this respect, it is critical to consider sustainable consumption together with sustainable production of legal and sustainably produced forest products, focusing on legality, sustainability, governance, and traceability, where sustainable production and consumption will complement circular economy approaches, generate income, and provide socio-economic benefits whilst ensuring the value of forests are enhanced. Now, the areas of work initiated by ITTO and still ongoing include the work on policies, the LSSE platform, which includes online learning resources, which is an output from the recent joint project that we have conducted with FAO and IUFRO on the legal and sustainable supply chains again, tracking and verification systems, and also assistance to the private sector. If we can please move to the next slide. Now, these are the 4 programmatic lines that were recently council approved for ITTO's focus in the next few years. And as you can see, we are not just involved in legal and sustainable supply chains, we are also involved in biodiversity and ecosystem services, forest landscape restorations aimed at resilient livelihoods and communities while increasing and generating income for communities, local communities and indigenous communities. And the last programmatic line is on emerging issues and innovation, which can cover almost anything that is urgent. And a recent very generous support from the government of Japan has resulted in 2 projects being implemented in Peru and Indonesia, focusing on forest fire management, which is also critical in the arguments and measures that we need to take against climate mitigation and adaptation. The next slide, please. Now, the ongoing initiatives I've already mentioned very, very quickly, but there are 2 other critical projects that we are still involved in, and one is together with CITES on their trees program, and this is aimed at assisting member governments and also the private sector in how to trade internationally in endangered species, provided they're still traceable and also tradable and are not completely endangered. And the last one is also with the generous support of the EU on independent market monitoring project, which also contributes towards our ITTO market information service, through which market information is generated once every fortnight for the benefit of members and the private sector. The next slide, please. Now, this is just a compilation of work that ITTO is involved in the international arena. It's just a quick recap, really, and it's just background information. Next slide, please. Now, the next few slides focus on the impact of COVID-19 on the ITTO in 2020 and 2021. again, with the background information, I will just recap it in 2 sentences to say that naturally the COVID-19 has had a significant impact on our field activities. But in general, most of our regular activities have continued without any hampering, but the field activities definitely have been hampered. And recently we have been conducting project steering committees virtually. And the hope is that we will be able to conduct field monitoring activities again on a regular basis as we used to, hopefully by Q4 of this year, if not by the first half of 2021. Now, we have been conducting virtual workshops as well, and we have been involved in a number of international initiatives by supporting private sector and also member governments on further understanding the need for legal and sustainable supply chains. Next slide, please. Please race through the next, because again, it is all background information on the projects that ITTO has been involved in, and participants may find it useful to go through these slides at a later stage for more detail on the kind of work that ITTO has been involved in. Further down, please. And the next one, please. And these are the concrete outputs of our legal and sustainable supply chains. Next slide, please. And these are examples of activities and projects that we have conducted in terms of community resilience and improved livelihoods, focusing on the role of women, and also timber tracking systems that are aimed at improved governance of sustainable supply chains in the tropics. What I would like to say lastly is the COVID-19, of course, has invariably increased the pressure on tropical forests, affecting the supply and demand of legal and sustainable production and also consumption. The urgency now lies in how to ensure the sustained yield of these goods and services while minimizing forest degradation and deforestation. And Dirk had put it very succinctly to say that producing countries need the continued support in trying to achieve these aims and objectives. There is a clear indication that the value and role of forests need to be recalibrated, as with the positioning of forests as a great potential towards climate mitigation and adaptation, as an effective means in turning the tide on deforestation and forest degradation, which can be achieved through carbon sequestration, carbon stocks, and carbon storage, not forgetting the added benefits brought by product substitution, where we reduce the use of less environmentally friendly materials. This applies not just to the tables and chairs that we sit on. Of course, the tables and chairs that we sit on and the homes that are built are critical products, but more of wood products needs to be used by the larger construction programs by consuming markets. Further active engagement with the climate sector is a priority for all of us together, in order to deliver the joint responsibility we bear on conserving precious forest resources. And finally, the replication and upscaling of successful ground projects is urgent to ensure and strengthen community resilience in pursuit of the SDGs 2030, particularly with the advent of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, the UN Strategic Program on Forests, the review of the International Arrangement on Forests, and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. With that, Musonda, I thank you so much for giving me the floor, and I will end my presentation. Thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you very much. Very insightful indeed. I know, sort of in the interest of time, I have one very quick question. You did mention in your presentation the issue of traceability. And so, what are some of the key issues, perhaps 2 or 3, why we're still having timber products on our markets that are coming from deforested areas, as it were?
Thank you for that question, Musonda. One of the key issues that I would think would be a bit of an issue to address really is the lack of capacity, the lack of expertise in certain countries and certain regions, and the lack of access to educational materials and technical training. This is where all these issues are critical in terms of knowledge and information sharing, and also training and capacity building. And the other thing that I wanted to say is, I think the global community has almost reached that peak of forest conversion for agricultural products. Or food products. Now, what we need to focus on now is try to to communicate and advocate the need to perhaps intensify agricultural production on existing agricultural land and not at the expense of remaining forest areas, whilst we help the producing communities to restore the degraded and mainly the degraded forest areas by improving the health of these forest areas, and also to restore forest areas in terms of replacing degraded forest areas with perhaps agroforestry, which would feed consumption patterns. Now, what we also have to address would be the consuming markets that are not particularly part of the actual legal and sustainable supply chains program. And this is where the ITTO is working hard with China and also with producing countries in the Congo Basin and Western Africa in trying to address the supply chains there. And also there are some areas, or when an area is termed as a deforested area or products are claimed to come from a deforested area, it depends on by whose definition it is classified as coming from a deforested area.
Okay.
In many countries, it can be deforested areas that were legalized because the land was not yielding what it was supposed to do in terms of a productive forest, which is why it has been converted either to a timber plantation or a far more economic yielding use, such as agriculture. So it's not always illegal.
Great. No, thank you very much for that point, for those points. And you mentioned the Congo Basin, and I've just seen a question there on the Congo Basin. We have to go now very quickly to Ms. Esther Nana Amasante to talk about something so wonderful that we all want, and just really wonderful that we're having you as the last speaker, chocolate that comes from cocoa. So we would like you to provide some insight to us and, in relation to Cocoa Farm Association in Ghana. Over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Yeah, I'm Esther from Cocoa, Ghana. Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for the opportunity. So I'll be presenting on deforestation-free supply chain, and the focus will be on sustainable production and consumption, how it can contribute to halt deforestation. So we will be talking mostly from the producer point of view. So the outline of the presentation, we would want to know who we are as GAFAP, Sustainable Production and Consumption, GAFAP Deforestation Free Cocoa Strategy. And then we'll conclude. So who we are as GAFAP. GAFAP is a National Federation of Forest Farm Producer Organizations drawn from 3 ecological zones in Ghana. That's the Savannah, Transition, and the Forest Zone. And it seeks to promote the interests of forest and farm producers. The evolution of GAFAP is influenced by its members to maximize its strength in numbers to build strong and profitable farmer-based organizations, farmer-based businesses, and also contribute to shaping national policies. A sustainable development, and its membership is about 1,042,880, representing 12 producer organizations, of whom 46% are women and 20% are youth. As I said earlier, from Cocoa organization of GAFAP. It coordinates the cocoa forest landscape, of which majority of the cocoa producer organizations are operated, and its membership is over 11,000. So when we are talking about the sustainable production, we want to tackle it from the GAFAP theory of change. So with this, we are looking at both the vertical and the horizontal relationship of the approaches outlined here that are intended to achieve both the short, intermediate, and production, right from aggregation through to the market development. Here, GAFAP is not only looking at having a green landscape, but also production system that can also bring economic returns. So we are saying that if the smallholder farmers are provided with the appropriate support to undertake green production, it will offer opportunities for livelihood diversification and climate change. And this would contribute to improving productivity and also support the aggregation of baskets of products. So when we take the horizontal relationship, we realize the vertical relationship, we realize that apart from the horizontal, the vertical is helping to realize the horizontal, in that we are seeing that for GAFA to realize its green market production strategy, we have to tackle it from the Green Ghana, which is under in the slide. So here we are looking at the ongoing partnership with GAFAP and the Ghana government, and then the forest landscape restoration, where cocoa producers will use a more sustainable way of charcoal production other than through deforestation. So as we move along the aggregation through to the market development, we need capital, that's money, and the right policies for all these to be realized. So now we are tackling the GAFA deforestation-free cocoa strategy. So here we have the two schools of thought. That's one, that cocoa production has been branded as the leading cause of deforestation in Ghana. And then the GAFA school of thought that says that, no, it's not totally attributed to cocoa production, but rather the illegal logging for timber and unregulated charcoal production, and also the illegal mining in Ghana are the major causes of the forest loss. And we are saying that to the extent that the cocoa farmers are part of the problem of deforestation in Ghana, they will be willing to integrate more trees in their farmlands if they are assured of tenure and benefit rights over them. So lastly, under this strategy, we seek to say that it's impossible to change the cocoa sector without the farmer organizations being at the table. They have a voice, they have the niche, so they have to be heard, and that they have to be supported in order to change the status quo. So here, promoting sustainable production and consumption in a bid to contribute to halting deforestation in Ghana. We are saying that for cocoa farmers to engage in sustainable production, they have to be motivated one way or the other to produce under the sustainable standards. So first of all, farmers have to be motivated by themselves to produce under these sustainable measures that would end up leading to deforestation-free supply chain. And also when they are also assured of their benefit and non-tenure rights over the trees they integrate in their lands, they'll be willing to do that, and then it will help reduce deforestation. And also promoting high demand for sustainable cocoa, because these are produced under sustainable standards. And also high market share for cocoa for farmers engaging in sustainable cocoa production. So when you are looking at the sustainable consumption, you are saying that consumers have to be educated to consume more of the sustainable cocoa. And also buyers should be committed to buy sustainable products so that these would motivate the farmers to produce more. And then in terms of taxes, there should be tax exemptions so that these prices of cocoa products would be, sustainable cocoa products would be less expensive for patronage to be high, and then it will end up motivating the farmers to be producing more. So basically, this is how the sustainable production and consumption could help in halting deforestation in Ghana. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Esther, for those amazing points. And just really seeing the percentages there, 46% women, 20% youth, you already see the constituency that is dependent on this particular sector. So I'm quite curious, cocoa farmers, are they duly represented within the national dialogues in Ghana? Are they at the table, as it were, on issues concerning cocoa sustainability?
Thanks so much for the question. Not really, they are not duly represented, as dialogues that borders on cocoa sustainability. And there were recent issues on the ongoing dialogue with EU, where the representation of farmers were more of intermediary organizations rather than the farmer-based member organizations. So in that case, it's impossible to change the cocoa sector without these farmer-based organizations on the table to offer the needed input. So in this case, GAFAP has the niche, it has the membership, and it produced almost 1/5 of Ghana's 800 tons of cocoa. And so therefore, in such dialogues, they have to be invited to be present and then offer the needed input.
No, that's really exciting. We really hope that they can be a part of these very important discussions, especially around the sustainability, especially we're dealing with very complex issues such as tenure and also, illegal mining and all of that. They need to really be sort of part of a much bigger constituency in the policy shift in Ghana. Thank you very much. I really want to thank all the panelists, but I cannot let you go off very quickly because we have some exciting questions that are just popping in. Mehdi, I'd like to start with you. I have a sort of two-pronged question actually from Leonie Meyer, but I'll start with the latter one, which is the forest and climate discussion is characterized by the potential for forests to contribute to climate change mitigation via afforestation, etc. However, let me just see this question. What is it saying? However, how should biodiversity considerations be factored into this discussion? What are the trade-offs between climate mitigation and biodiversity conservation? Over.
Thank you. And it's a good question. It's one that has been discussed in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change as well. Biodiversity conservation is one of the additional benefits, if you will, if you look at particularly in halting deforestation. So when we're talking about forests, and we're talking about the need to turn the tide on deforestation, we're actually contributing to both climate change mitigation and to biodiversity conservation, because we do know that, as I mentioned earlier, forests contain the vast majority of the terrestrial biodiversity, and our best way of keeping that is, of course, to maintain and protect our forests. Where there might be a trade-off is where you want to plant fast-growing tree species to capture more carbon, and you are not doing that in the right place, if you will. So if you are converting peatlands, if you are converting wetlands, if you are converting a natural habitat that has a big value in its own right to a monocultural plantation in order to produce carbon, then clearly you have trade-offs. So on a small scale, perhaps that's something that can be incorporated within a landscape. We also need to increase our production of timber so that we can use perhaps the timber from the planted forest rather than from the natural forest in some areas. So you need to have a look at what you want to do where. It's very, very important that we don't just go out and plant trees everywhere because it's good for the climate. We do need to find out where to plant and what to plant. And it's not just about planting, it's about caring for, it's about cultivating, it's about managing for a long period of time. And we need to keep that in mind too. If we maintain our forests and mainstream sort of biodiversity conservation into them, that also means that we keep bigger, older trees, we keep some of the wood that's fallen down on the ground. And again, that will also help us with the climate change mitigation in terms of keeping a larger biomass on the ground. But we do need to have a look at both aspects. And I think in most cases, there's a synergy rather than a trade-off. But as I said, there are a couple of cases where we do need to have a look at the trade-offs.
Great. No, thank you very much. Where to plant, what to plant, all those considerations. Thank you so much. I see that there's some questions that are popping in the chat function, and we're supposed to be in Q&A, so that you don't feel like I'm ignoring you. There is a question from Denis Jean Saunois, who is asking Sham. He's asking you, Sham, too, and wondering, you mentioned the importance of using wood materials as climate change mitigation strategy. Why are you, ITTO, doing, what are you, ITTO, doing to mainstream climate change considerations in the small manufacturing wood material sector across Africa? Because if you put together all the small manufacturers of wood products in urban Africa, one can realize that they're managing a small biomass quantity close to industrial one. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that question, Musonda. I had just replied to Dennis actually to say that ITTO has just embarked on highlighting the importance of using legally and sustainably produced wood products and also the role that forests can play to the climate arena. And this is something that we are also actively advocating within the membership of ITTO, which includes, of course, the manufacturing sector in Africa. Now, we have had active collaboration with the African private sectors in Cameroon, Congo-Brazzaville, Gabon, and also Central African Republic in trying to, again, disseminate knowledge and the need to comply with legal and sustainable supply chains. Now, where the smallholders are concerned, generally in tropical countries, they are grouped together as cooperatives. And this is another group that we will be reaching out to in time. This will be part of our legal and sustainable supply chains program, which is actually being funded with the generous support from the federal government of Germany through the German Ministry for Food and Forestry and Agriculture. And one of the plans would be to try and again replicate the elements contained within this program within our membership. So I leave it there for now.
Great, and thank you so much for responding to some of the questions in the chat there.
You're
but please do remember to share your questions over in the Q&A function. That way I can see them and not miss them. There is a question here for you, Dirk, from James Griffiths, who is in Geneva in Switzerland. How significant is the role of voluntary sustainable standards and production and product certification in turning the tide on deforestation?
Thank you for that question. Well, I would say, as I tried to indicate.
Dirk, could you just speak closer to your mic, please, because it's a bit low, the sound.
Okay, it's better now.
Brilliant, better, thank you.
Okay, as I lined out in my presentation, we see, let's say, even if we would like to have it more easier, we see a complex relationship in the different parts of the smart mix we need here. Obviously, we would prefer if voluntary guidelines would help us to solve the problem in the best way alone. But let's say the experience in a lot of fields shows that we need voluntary efforts in a structure together with regulatory efforts. So here you have to find the right mix, and the mix might be different depending on the sector you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But I think in general, one part does not go alone, but has to be mixed with, let's say, a sort of enforcement option, at least, mm-hmm. To make voluntary efforts more effective.
Great. No, thank you very much for that response. I want to come to you, Esther, because there's a question from Nancy here, and perhaps you could respond, and maybe other people on the panel can also add to this. And Nancy from Kenya is wondering, how can forest access be more accessible to persons or for persons with disabilities? The issue of obviously making sure that there is inclusivity in access to forests, if you've had some experience. Do we still have Esther?
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. So for us as COCOPA, we have extension officers that go to the farms and give all the good agricultural practices training to the farmers. So, and most of them are females, and then some are males. So with persons of disability, they could Mushanda.
We just lost you for a minute there. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Could Elvis give a clearer explanation to this?
Absolutely. If Elvis is available. Okay, we just lost Esther there. Oh, there's Elvis. Elvis, over to you. If you can just give us a response in relation to how you go about this. Over to you, please.
Yeah, okay, thank you for this opportunity. In most of the work that the farmer organizations do on the ground, they engage with different groups of people. And under the umbrella of the Ghana Federation of Forest and Farm Producers, they have a distant social protection and strategy, of which they identify the vulnerable and the most marginalized groups who are engaged, who are supported to benefit and participate directly in these activities. Mm-hmm. And that vulnerability assessment does not only focus or look at only people with disability, but it also includes other challenges people face, including nursing mothers, pregnant women, mm-hmm. and all those aspects. So each of the forest and farm-based organizations have their internal social protection strategies. And one of the things that includes the issues of disability. Mm-hmm. Now, in some of the areas, people with disability have access some capacity building support, and we also have the government programs that provide some support at the district assembly level to people with disability. So they also try to link up to access some of these social services support for their members. But then at the bigger level, there's also an emerging social protection strategy that GAFAP is developing in partnership with the Ministry of Gender, Children, and Social Protection, of which GAFAP members were giving recently a trainer of trainers program, mm-hmm. Which is supposed to be expanded later this year to cover a 1-week training for more members, so that at the end of the day, a major outcome will be a GAFAP social protection strategy, linking with government existing social protection services initiatives, which will include things benefiting people with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Elvis. That's really impressive. I mean, to sort of hear about how that is being done, the social protection strategy, the trainer of trainers initiative that you've had, and really fantastic to see this example happening within the cocoa supply chain, as it were. I see that there is a question, another question here from Maharaj Muthu. Okay, right. So I don't know where Maharaj is actually contacting us from, but perhaps this question for Dirk. Just bear with me a minute. The question is, why forest sector does not receive requisite support, especially keeping in view that climate change is a challenge that can be mitigated and adapted fast forward by maintaining, restoring, and extending the Earth's tree cover and related grasslands? I think this might be actually a meta question, but if Dirk can respond.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. It's a good question. I basically have 2 answers. Mm-hmm. Yes, you are right. There's a need for more funding for the forest sector, but on the other hand, there's already very much on the way. So I mean, and it was, let's say, a little bit outlined by the other colleagues at the panel, that a lot of efforts are already done, but more is needed. Absolutely. For Germany, I can say that we are the 2nd largest donor in the sector, and we will keep going with our efforts. And I personally do expect, please don't quote it as a government opinion, that we will even increase our efforts in the future. And absolutely clear is that, let's say, the forest sector proponents need to advocate at the upcoming large summits and the COPs, that the forest sector gets the share it needs. And this is a thing, I think, a task that we are working on all together, and I'm optimistic that we can be successful.
Great. Thank you. No, thank you very much for that response, Dirk, and please do not quote him, as he rightly said. I do see a question there from Jennifer Myers. It's a very general question. I don't know what about the Congo Basin. If you can rephrase that question, perhaps if we have some time, we can respond. She's just asking any interest in the Congo Basin forest and watershed. I think there is massive interest. I think based on Mete's response and presentation, there was a lot of discussion on these forests. There is a question here, perhaps I can direct it to Sham. Here's a question again from Leon Maya, wanting to understand that company commodity certification is not sufficient to ensure legal and sustainable supply chains. What can be done about it? How can SMEs be integrated in the certification market, as often they're unable to pay for expensive certification and their products are then excluded from the market?
Thank you very much for that question, Musonda. Now, in terms of product certification, it is not something that ITTO can be actively involved in because it just doesn't fall within our mandate. Although we do collaborate quite closely with both the two existing international forest product certification schemes, which is the Forest Stewardship Council and the Program for Endorsement of Forest Certification. Now, to my knowledge and through my past involvement with the PEFC, and I'm sure it also applies to the FSC, they do have a scheme called group certification, which is meant to encompass the smallholders and the small, either private forest owners or the smallholders. I mean, in essence, the PEFC forest certification scheme is precisely that. It consists of the most of the world's small forest owners, particularly in Europe as well as in the United States. So that is one way of addressing it, in which case the actual certification costs are far reduced when they go in for certification as a group. I would recommend contacting either the PEFC Secretariat in Geneva or the FSC head office in Bonn to find out further details on how either or both schemes can be of help there.
All right, no, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
This last and final question, in the interest of time, is coming from Patrick Callas. A very detailed question there. You can see all the numbers, the recent OECD report on the 720 billion per year in agriculture subsidies. So the question therefore is, perhaps Mete or Sham, you can actually respond to this, perhaps Mete. The question is, if I may, what does the panel think about the role of repurposing agriculture subsidies to address the issues of deforestation?
Yeah.
I can start. I'm sure there are others that would like to add into this. But clearly, when you look at what we have in that joint statement that the Collaborative Partnership on Forests put together, one of the actions that we have in there is that there is a need to reform subsidies and incentives, not just in the agricultural sector, but certainly also within the agricultural sector, to have a look at what incentives are creating a positive incentive to maintain forest, conserve biodiversity, restore degraded land, and what incentives are actually providing a perverse incentive to clear forest to provide for food production or have incentives or subsidies for fossil fuels. There are a number of them out there that are perhaps not best aligned. So what we're really calling for is to have that policy coherence. Countries have already committed to sustainable development goals. They've already committed to halting deforestation. Now we need to make sure that all of the policies of the government policies, so the domestic fiscal policies, as well as the policies of investment banks and on big private companies, are aligned to meet those goals. So we need a very thorough review of existing incentives and subsidies to see how we can perhaps tweak them to align them better with the goals we want to achieve.
Thank you, Mete. Sham, you have some thoughts very quickly?
Very briefly, I couldn't agree more with Mete, and also with that question to say that there does need a careful review of existing subsidies and perhaps review and revamp or even get rid of the harmful subsidies. And I think what could counter-purpose that would be creating positive incentives, marketplace-based incentives for the production of legal and sustainable supply chains for both agriculture as well as forest products. That's what I have to say. Thank you.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen out there, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, and I'm seeing now questions flooding in. And I really hope from the team and the sort of in the back end from the CPF team that you can put an email in there where maybe some of these questions can be emailed to or addressed, because that's so interesting and they're so amazing. Alas, I'm aware that we're all navigating a virtual world, rushing to meetings, in between meetings whilst we're still seated, actually moving across continents, as it were. But I want to thank you, Esther, Sham, Dirk, and Mette, and really thank you so much for that brilliant keynote from Francesca, which was just absolutely amazing and really hit the nail on the head in terms of how do we navigate this world that has changed so substantively and bring together the convergence of not just the degradation forest, but also the complexity of climate change as it's compounded by this degradation, furthermore, by the biodiversity that we lose, and also very much by the livelihoods that we lose, because this is all about people and planet. And then lastly, but not the least, I think we've seen from the panelists the intersectionality of the forest ecosystems for food, for shelter, and really for phytopharmacies, for medicines, as it were, and also very much for the very healing systems, the cleaning of the atmosphere and all of that. These are such beautiful ecosystems. So how do we turn the tide on deforestation? You have an amazing role to play. And very importantly, you are also part of the change that needs to really be effected. Thank you so much for listening in. I really would like to thank the technical team behind the team, those that you've not seen who are incredibly amazing in making sure that we had the notes and they reached out to speakers, and also made it sure that you can actually connect and join this amazing HLPF session. And I really would like to wish everyone who's participating in other different sessions out there all the best. And please let us do what we need to do to really turn the tide on deforestation, a very important topic and a very important ecosystem. And I just want to really wish you all the best. Merci encore, Denis, and wish you a really wonderful, and please be safe and all the best. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.